I just wanted to start off with a little bit of a reflection. So last year, Tim, it wasn't Tim and Dominic, it was Tim and Tom Koutsantonis, but I asked the two treasurers last year to reflect on why they'd got into Parliament, why they'd become politicians. And it was interesting, just to paraphrase, Tim, I hope you don't mind, but you noted that you're a politician by misadventure from memory, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but certainly suggests that there was a little bit of up and down through the process. And also you did reflect on the fact that your father, from memory, had highlighted that you wanted to, or his mantra was to make sure you give back more than you get from communities. And I thought that really stayed with me, and it's certainly, I think it's a great concept for us all to think about. But I did want to get, Dominic, your thoughts on why you got into politics and why you've taken the role you've got.
Damien, I think politics is certainly one of those professions where you can make a real difference to people's lives. And it's also, as somebody who I was at university, the challenge, the battle of ideas was something that certainly I enjoyed engaging with. And I think it's certainly, I see it as a vocation and a role. Previous to getting into politics, I was an insolvency lawyer, so I don't know what's worse, saying I was an insolvency lawyer or a politician. Look, it is certainly a job where, and particularly I think Tim would agree, as treasurers, where after just delivering budgets, where you get into politics, you want to make a difference, and it's one of those jobs when you finish a budget where you can be in the books all the time and see the numbers all the time, but when you go out there and you actually see the dividends of the work that you take every day, I think is something that there's very clear reasons as to why you get into politics, because you can certainly make a substantive change.
Is delivering a budget as glamorous as it looks from the outside?
We try to make it look better on the outside than it actually is on the inside, because there's obviously some robust issues. But look, at the same time as well, you want to leave your state in a better place than you found it. And look, it's I've wrapped up one last week, the second one, and there's no doubt there's challenges all the time, but we've got some strong financial management over the course of the last period of time in New South Wales, and we've really set our state up for success, not just for the future, but also making sure we can help out with today.
And Tim, from your perspective, clearly you've come and done this dinner 4 times in a row. You're the standing champion. Obviously, you've shed Tom from last year, so you've brought a replacement Dominic in this year. What's the secret to four budgets? So what's been the learning curve over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank CEDA for inviting me back. I don't normally get invited back to functions, and those of you who were here last year, which was the Tom and Tim show, where we basically razzed each other for most of the discussion. Before that, it was the Gladys and Tim show, where it was really an argument about my state's better than your state. Probably not a edifying conversation, but one that certainly I enjoyed. And before that, of course, we had a few more treasurers, and I think they realised that probably my contribution to the evening's discussion has put them off. So, Dominic,
I'll be here for the next 6, mate, if you want.
I appreciate you being here.
One of the concepts we were talking about over dinner, which came up, was the Board of Treasurers. So, Dominic, I know that from what I understand, that's an idea that you first hatched, but it'd be great to get some insight into what that's all about, and maybe the difference it might have made to the treasurers in their experience and the way that they can lead the national agenda.
Yeah, look, Damien, I think it was really important from my first experience being a state's treasurer and going to what were equivalent to the COAG meetings, that it was very much driven at a Commonwealth level. And as somebody who believes in having a strong federation, I think as state treasurers, we have a great obligation in promoting ideas and promoting policy, and not just have those areas driven from a Commonwealth level. And kind of the experience that I've had is you kind of sit around this table and it's a bit of a blame game scenario, and that's we're going to have our perspective, and the Commonwealth's going to take their perspectives. But the reality is, if you take party politics out of it, I have more in common with this guy than I have with the Commonwealth Treasurer, in the sense that our issues are a lot more aligned. But we also have a greater responsibility outside that KIFA process to be promoting ideas and promoting policies. And already we've had a number of meetings which I think have been incredibly productive and constructive in sharing the different ideas. Tim raised a number of issues with me that we've incorporated in our budget. There are reform opportunities that our treasuries are now working together on promoting, and at the same time there are areas which we are taking to the Commonwealth, because this is not about the states versus the Commonwealth. We certainly believe in competitive federalism, but at the same time this probably skews a little bit more to the fact that we should cooperate a little bit more, and where there are areas of reform we can work together and put those ideas up at a Commonwealth level.
And Tim, obviously we saw a little bit of press today around the GST and how that might be impacting states, and obviously Victoria's at the front of your mind, I'm sure. So the Board of Treasurers, how does that work from a GST discussion perspective? And maybe just adding some thoughts on what you were contemplating today when you saw when you talked to the press.
Yeah, well, look, I think first of all I want to acknowledge the efforts that Dominic's taken in terms of getting the Board of Treasurers up and running. Like, there's a lot of politicians who think it's a great opportunity to just play on your own side of the fence and take pot shots at the other side. But I take the view that ultimately states are about delivery of services, the efficient delivery of services, and once you've got your balance sheet in place, well, then you can have the ideological discussion about how you see the society operating, and those areas that probably on any normal day would essentially constitute the thing that occupy the Parliament, but don't occupy our thinking too often. So I would say it was a pretty gutsy call, and I can remember being in a meeting with Dominic when he suggested, why don't we set up a Board of Treasurers, because after all, we're in the business of service delivery. Why don't we start to share ideas? Now, it happens anyway, but it happens by osmosis normally. So case mix funding is a classic illustration where one state had a go at it, and eventually it worked its way through. And if you think about this, our federation works best when we compete and we cooperate in equal measure. We compete to come up with good ideas to steal an advantage over the other states, and we cooperate when we recognise that it's in our collective interests that we raise the quality and the capacity of public administration more generally. So I thought it was a very gutsy call, and I think the simple answer is we tend to agree on most things that go to service delivery. Yes, we will always have an argument about our share of the pie, and the Commonwealth are always very keen to highlight the fact that the states like to advocate their brief for their interests in terms of what they're due. But from my perspective, that tends to be relatively peripheral in the long term. We have a system in place that determines how revenue is set. All I want is a simple and transparent process that clearly identifies who gets what, so that you can plan your budgets around it. And from my perspective, working cooperatively with states comes naturally more often than not. Yep, we'll disagree about whose state is best, and I think we can just take it as read that Victoria wins that. But what we
protest too much.
Look, mate, you won state of origin by playing in Melbourne first.
But we're also building some good stadiums to catch up.
But look, quite frankly, we do work very well together, and it's important that we do, because politics is something like, if Dominic and I spent much time comparing our respective political views, we'd probably differ quite considerably. But when it comes to do we believe in the efficient delivery of services, how best can we go about it, you will find that there is common ground. And that common ground is how do we minimise costs, how do we maximise outcomes, and how do we make sure our respective constituencies are well served by the governments that provide the services to them. And overwhelmingly, that's the states.
We've got a big year ahead, gentlemen, so obviously you've just delivered a budget, but I know November this year, Tim, you're at the polls, and I think it's March 19 for you, Dominic, so that's your last budget before elections. I'd love to get, and hopefully the audience would appreciate a little bit of insight into what it's like being a treasurer going through an election process. Obviously, they don't happen every day, every 3 or 4 years, but...
You're probably a better place for that, Tim, because I've never been a treasurer going through an election process. So you got any tips?
Neither have I, Dom.
Okay,
we might have to.
I might ask the audience for input then if these guys can't help out.
So I've been a treasurer for 4 years. I produced a opposition list of election commitments and funding, and what I can say about the process of trying to apply the financial rigour to your election commitments is it isn't much different from producing a budget, in the sense that you have to make sure that you've adequately accounted for the promises you're putting. For Labor, it tends to be a little bit more difficult. The bar is a bit higher in respect to them, so making sure that you've got processes of independent scrutiny and analysis, I think, are important, and it's certainly a process that we've tended to apply in the past. We're a little bit more fortunate in the sense that, of course, we have a department that can give us advice on policy initiatives. What they can't give us advice on is election initiatives. So that very skillful dance of listening to the ideas that ministers have, not compromising the integrity of your department, and then still being able to put forward a quality and comprehensive list of the impact that your election commitments have on your long-term budget, that is your government's budget position. It's part art, part science, and part luck. And let's hope I get that the measurements right.
Any thoughts from your perspective?
Well, look, I mean, obviously we make sure from Tim's point, it's easier in government in terms of the way that you're naturally averse to the way the costing system works, and you make sure that you're leveraging off the experience and the knowledge in the department, and you'll take that through to the election process. But obviously, from our perspective, at a New South Wales level, we're in a strong financial position. The good times hopefully will keep rolling.
You did. It's very, very pointy. You mentioned that. You did mention last year after the budget that New South Wales was the envy of the Western world when you delivered the budget last year. So, how would you position New South Wales at the moment? Is it still the envy?
Well, certainly the envy of the eastern states. No, look, I think, as Paul made the point, from our perspective as a conservative government, that financial management and social outcomes are two sides of the same coin. I made that point last week, and we take to our job every day that strong fiscal management that's enabled us to make record investments in this recent budget. Someone said during the press conference, have you just delivered a Labor budget because of the investments? Like, well, I think it's a pretty sad indictment of the Liberal Party if when we're talking about people or talking about education and health, that apparently that's Labor's space. I disagree completely. I think our role is to have that strong financial management so we can make those investments in the things that matter to people's lives. And what I was most pleased about in this budget period was that we've leveraged off that. We had a record infrastructure investment of $87 billion over the next 4 years, and a significant proportion of that in schools, in hospitals, but at the same time, having the capacity to ease the cost of living, because we know particularly in Sydney it can be a challenge. So making sure that we're delivering not just easing the cost of living, but making the investments in more teachers, more nurses at the same time. But importantly, making sure that we're looking after the next generation. And we set up a generations fund to help with the obviously to retire debt going forward and the issues in that space. So it was an all-encompassing budget, but one that you can't deliver if you don't take that financial management to your job each and every day. And you know, that's, as I said at the start, you get into politics because you really want to make a difference to people's lives, but not just for today. We have a contract to make sure we leave our state better off for those who come after us. And I think one of the biggest issues in politics these days is that you kind of focus. I mean, you just asked the question, how are you looking for the next election? Sure, you want to win the next election because you believe that your policies are superior to the opposition's and the way that you approach things is better. But at the same time, you want to make sure you're delivering for the next generation and making our state the best place that it can be going forward. And that's probably what I was most pleased about in this year's budget.
It is interesting, Tim. Again, last year you made the comment that you wanted to make sure that you didn't waste the current prosperity for the ability to grow the state and grow the state in long term. I guess that's your point to a degree, Dominic, around making sure the good times can be long term. How do you rate, Tim, where Victoria's at the moment from that long-term prosperity perspective?
I think it would be true to say that we've seen a massive improvement in our material circumstances. Our economic circumstances have improved quite dramatically, but there's still plenty more work to do. The investment or the infrastructure backlog is quite enormous. I've sort of struggled to compare Dominic's infrastructure agenda with ours, but we basically identify in this year, in this budgeted year coming, about $78 billion worth of investment, but that's from the whole government sector. In terms of the investment that's occurring within the general government sector, it's closer to 13.7 billion and 10.1 over the forward estimates. And it's not the size of the investment that matters. In fact, we're crowding each other out a bit in terms of the marketplace. It's about the results that you get for it. So we recognise that we're both under pressure from population growth. Perhaps Melbourne probably gets claimed to say that we're suffering from it most, and that's probably one of the reasons why GST receipts are so high at the moment. But I would say that with population growth comes both challenges and opportunity, and you can look at it and bemoan the fact that you face these challenges, or you could see it as a great opportunity to grow the state and the collective welfare of the community. But the one thing that you can't do is just sit around and do nothing, because the practical consequence of that will be to slow the economy. Yes, you'll probably slow population growth, but you'll also lose a lot of opportunity for the next generation. So the one thing that Dominic and I agree, well, there are many things we agree upon, but on this, it is, you've got to seize the moment. The opportunities are clear to the state of Victoria, and quite frankly, the Federation works best when Sydney and Melbourne are both working with a competitive spirit between them, but also recognising that we lift, all boats rise on a rising tide when it comes to the East Coast economies.
Just on that, Damien, early in my budget speech, I raised the fact that we don't control the levers of population, but we certainly control how we respond. And that is building the infrastructure that will make a real difference. And particularly in New South Wales right now, or a Sydney focus, we've got a 3 cities vision. And we're making sure that as the population grows, that infrastructure is around it. And I completely agree with Tim. It's not about the size of the spend, it's about the outcomes. And one of the great aspects, I think, with the Board of Treasurers as well, is that communication between state treasurers and the states on potentially staging infrastructure projects and making sure we're working closely together ensures that we do get value for money, particularly as the market tightens.
I asked a question today, and this is for Melinda, that I wanted to test your thoughts on productivity growth. So that is clearly the unicorn at the moment. It's pretty hard to find. But what are the thoughts? I mean, infrastructure is one, obviously, that's seen to be a strong driver of productivity growth. Education skills is another one. But where do you sort of see your states placed in that, and how do you... you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but what's your sort of time frame around when you want to see strong productivity growth flowing through the states? Why don't you?
Well, I'll open the batting if you like. This is where I do get to gloat a little bit about the state of Victoria. Our productivity share of our per capita share of productivity has grown by 0.9% in the last 12 months. I think the average for the states was 0.4. So we've done better than twice the growth per capita, and that's as close an approximation of wealth appreciation across the entire community as you can get. For all that, I think we could see that we're getting productivity growth occur. Our GSP in Victoria has grown by 3.3% in the last 12 months. If you look at the national average, it's sitting around 2%. You're doing better than that though, Dom. Behind us though, I'd say. But
maybe there's one thing. That's good.
But look, the real challenge, I think, is not to focus on whether you can push the numbers up on any given year, but to recognise it's a slow, consistent level of per capita GDP growth that we've got to invest in. Importantly, what we're also seeing, both New South Wales and Victoria, in terms of wage price index and CPI above the Reserve Bank's 2% level. So our two economies are doing, we're almost in that sweet spot that the Reserve Bank says is where we want to be. And I often say that it would be remiss of me not to try and talk down the Australian dollar because the East Coast economies do very nicely out of it. I think we're getting close to where I think the dollar should be. We're sitting around 74 US, maybe 3 or 4 cents below. That would be perfect. But what that does is it puts the things that we sell to the world right into a competitive marketplace. And by that, I'm talking services. About 76% of the state of Victoria's economy, I think about 70% of New South Wales' economy is services based. And what that means is that we have to invest in our people and their skills. As we educate our community, we have more to sell because essentially it's our expertise, whether it's education services, the biggest money spinner for the state of Victoria, or whether it's engineering, professional services, you name it. Those contributions, they might be intangible in a lot of people's minds, but they're very real in terms of what they do to the comparative performance of the Victorian economy.
How about you, Dom?
Yeah, Damien, look, obviously productivity is front and centre for New South Wales as well, and we really do see it as the next wave and a significant opportunity. Our productivity is, I'd challenge Tim's view in terms of the numbers. I think we're outpacing them, but we'll have that.
It's about time you disagree
We'll
on
have that.
something.
We'll have that debate another day. But if you look at, let's look at for a start on the public investment in infrastructure at the moment. That's only about 0.5% to our economic growth over the last 2 years, and we'll do also over the next year. It's about 4 times the rate of the long-term average growth there. But one of the things that struck me early on when we went to our first KIFA meeting was that the Productivity Commission had come out with a report in respect of areas for reform. And a lot of those areas were wholly located within the state's own jurisdictions. So one of the things I initiated early on was establishing a Productivity Commission in New South Wales. And we've just appointed the former Auditor General in New South Wales, Peter Arkestrad, to head that up, and he's just begun that. And some of the key areas there are, making housing more affordable, reducing the cost of living, making it easy to do business, and making New South Wales the easiest place to move to. And tasking him with that, we located that role wholly within Treasury for the view that I think You can generally get some ideas with the Productivity Commission, which, whilst outside government, look at the way the world should be, without slightly disconnected from the political realities that states and the Commonwealth face. So we've established this role within Treasury, also working through the Board of Treasurers, which Tim and I have both been working on in terms of where are the areas of where we can drive productivity at a state level and share that information. In our last meeting, which we had in Victoria a few weeks back, share some of the ideas sharing on the productivity side. We're going to be bringing back to our next meeting in New South Wales in August.
And I suppose just to add to that, should be on. Damien, is that like we do share a lot of ideas, and probably the budgets are the most obvious example of the ideas that we're sharing. The stuff we've done on housing affordability, whether it's stamp duty thresholds, or whether it's the foreign purchaser surcharge on acquisition. We've all sort of approached these things from different perspectives. Whether it's the stuff we've done in this budget, which both our budgets basically put an emphasis on skills, and the effort that governments need to put into making sure that we get the skills for a growing economy. These things don't happen by accident. We talk all the time about, well, what more can we do? And if you think about it this way, the revenue that the states collectively have is about the same as what the Commonwealth has. So if essentially we just see the states as warring fiefdoms, then it's a misapplication of a considerable amount of the resources of the people of this country. So the fact that we work cooperatively, that we bounce ideas back and forward, and that Dominic quite inaccurately seeks to claim an economic status that I dispute, all of those things are good.
It's hard being number two, isn't it?
Well, you'll find out in about 10 years. No, I love Sydney. I love Sydney. It's a great place. In fact, look, the one thing I will say is that we've got to get beyond the parochialism of the campaigns and the arguments we have. And I'll give you one good reason. I was born in Newcastle, New South Wales. Now, people will say, well, you're a fraud. You're a Victorian now. I say, no, I'm a Victorian by choice, not by accident.
But to Tim's point, I think having that competitive tension between two of the largest states in the nation drives better outcomes. And it's not just, me waking up wanting to beat Tim every day. It's actually also looking at the things that Victoria's doing and having our treasuries work together. And I think both of us have adopted various policies because we've got very similar jurisdictions in many ways that we can share our thinking. And also where there's areas of reform, looking at opportunities where we can work together, which also assists from the political side of things, particularly if you've got two states with different political parties running them. If they're both running a reform agenda in the same vein, I think that certainly helps getting the job done.
And I would just call out, thanks Dom, thanks Tim, I would call out that we'll open up to questions in 5 minutes or so, so please, if you've got any questions, get thinking. Certainly also the live stream, if you've got any questions, you can use that as well. I wouldn't mind just testing both of your thoughts on the happiness of the electorate. So I guess there was a bit of a conversation today, and I think it's certainly been a bit of a theme around populism or pushbackism or whatever we sort of suggest people, the populace are thinking around politics. And we've certainly seen that in a number of offshore jurisdictions. But I'd love to get your sense of what the Australian electorates are sort of saying to you. Do you think there's a change, or is it business as usual and the way you'll move the next elections pretty much as you'd expect?
Well, I think politics and politicians, your job is to meet people where they are, and if you're going to embark on reform, take people with you. Some people have complained. Lindsay Tanner wrote that book many years ago, around the 24-hour news cycle and that being more challenging for politicians to be more relevant and getting their message out. I think there's some truth to that, but there's a greater opportunity there as well for politicians to use that 24-hour news cycle to get your message out and to understand where the concerns are and bring people with you. I think, if you look at political parties, I've spoken about this before, that from our side of politics, I think there's been, from the Conservative side, not here, but around the world, that being too close to big business, and I think the Labor Party's been too close to the union movement. And I think at the end, in the middle, they feel a bit disconnected from the policies of the day. Our job as politicians is to explain very clearly to the electorate why we're doing what we're doing, the benefits of the reforms and the decisions that we're making, and how that is improving their lives, and why we believe our approach works. At the last election, Mike Baird was the Premier of New South Wales, and he took a policy to the people of our state around the recycling of assets, which has delivered billions of dollars, which we are now in a position which we can invest in better schools and better hospitals across the state. We've got $8 billion in hospital capital expenditure over the next 4 years, $6 billion in schools. That $87 billion across the board would not be possible but for the decisions we took. But what we were able to do, rather than saying, I was saying, some states have failed saying they're going to pay off debt. Well, I think always the public sit there and say, well, the debt's the government's debt and those assets are our assets. So that can be a challenge in terms of making that point. Whereas if you actually say or demonstrate that this is what you have now and this is what the benefit, this is why we're doing it, not what we're doing, why we're doing it, and this is the benefit to the people of the state, I think you can take them on the journey, and that's a challenge. I don't think the public might get a little bit disengaged, but it's our job as politicians to clearly explain why we're doing it and prosecute the case better.
How about you, Tim? Any different thoughts?
Well, not so much different, but just to augment that, I mean, politicians complaining about the fact that the electorate can be difficult and demanding is, a bit like pulling lint out of your navel. Well, of course they are. That's the very nature of the political dimension. I mean, because it's there, you can't simply complain about it. It's a fact of life, and so it should be. I mean, I like being Treasurer. I like being in government, but you can't take things for granted. And yes, I think we live in a time of increasing levels of scepticism directed towards politicians in particular. We also live in a time where people's tolerance for delay in delivery is remarkably shorter than it may have been in the past. And that just means we've got to be better at what we do. It's not about complaining about the dimension that we operate in, because believe me, there are plenty of others who will occupy the space if we can't make our case adequately. So, look, I suppose the contribution that Dom made, just in case anybody thought we were on an absolute unity ticket, we aren't. I mean, I have a view that you have to, for example, use debt responsibly and advisedly. In Victoria, it's below the level I inherited from the government that we took over from. It's down about 4.6% of GSP at the moment. It'll progressively move up to about 6% of GSP.
Just for the record, New South Wales is much lower.
Yeah. Moving up to 4% though, Dom. What we are doing is recognising that, look, we have two of the world's 10 sub-sovereign jurisdictions that are double-rated AAA in the world are sitting at this table. And we didn't get that by accident. It's through good management by various administrations over a long period of time. We can't squander that bounty, but we also need to make choices about how best you leverage it. For me, I don't intend essentially saying just because there's a magic number around debt that as a state we should not be prepared to look at how you leverage interest rates that are at such an all-time low in order to get on and deliver. But there are a variety of different views, and certainly from my perspective, that debate is one that this country has to have. How quick can you go, and indeed how much cost we incur to each other if we go too quick, because Dominic's doing a lot of capital works, I'm doing a lot of capital works, and we might start to crowd each other out of the market as well if we're not careful.
And David, look, just on the debt position, certainly what's assisted us in New South Wales has been our asset recycling program, and I call it the secret sauce to our success. And I do give credit to Tim in a lot, whether it's the ports or the land titles office, and that once again, that's another example of us sharing our information in terms of that transaction and how we've been able to realise capital which we can invest in further infrastructure. But that approach, making better use of what we have as a state, has certainly assisted us in not having to increase debt levels to an unmanageable rate, maintain our AAA credit rating, whilst at the same time delivering services and investing record amounts in infrastructure.
Well, one last question for me before we throw it open to the floor, but please be ready with your questions. I just wanted to ask both of you what your thoughts are for your the education and also the jobs your kids may have. So, Dominic, I know you've got anyone with more kids than I've got's a personal hero. I think you've got 5 kids. I've got 3, so well ahead of me. And I think, Tim, you've got a couple, haven't you? Yeah. But what's your thoughts on what your kids may do in the future?
Well, I think the world is rapidly changing, and governments need to keep up with that pace. And whilst that's not, our role is, I think, to be fast followers and to get out of the way, allow businesses to flourish and innovate. There's no doubt there are jobs today that will not be around in years to come. But I'm less concerned of the jobs that they will have, but more the lifestyle that they will have. And as a father of 4 daughters, a world in which they're able to manage their work and family life, they're able to go and retrain. I think, the days of my parents' generation, which have had the same job. My dad works in the US and the World Bank. He's kind of been there his entire career almost. That there will no doubt be the need for the next generation who will not just have different jobs, but there'll be the importance there of them having to retrain in different skills. And I think the way of the past of you go to or you leave school, you have a trade, or you go to university, and then that's it, that sets you up. I just think that is something of the past. And what will need to happen is governments providing an avenue for that flexibility, for retraining, going and changing your profession as the jobs of the future come online. So, look, as I said, it's less about the job that they will have, but more about the opportunity and providing the opportunity, and that's why we've set up the Generations Fund in this budget, to make sure the next generation is not saddled with debt going forward. But importantly, making sure we're setting up an environment where they can retrain, they can balance their work life, because there's no doubt we find it challenging today, balancing in politics particularly, balancing work life. We were just talking about this earlier. But I think it's only going to get more challenging, and we need to set up the structures to assist that going forward.
Too many thoughts?
Well, as I say, I'm probably the least notable achievement, with only 2 offspring. But I do worry about the future for our kids, and I suppose every parent does. And the one thing we can hope to gift our children is an efficiently functioning economy, one that preserves the livability of our urban environment, recognises that we have an environment that needs to be preserved as well. So getting that balance right, the economic, the social and the environmental. But I'd also say that we do need to start challenging ourselves around education. I don't think we've done it particularly well. And I don't mean that as a criticism of people whose efforts may have been played out in the past, but the world is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. And if you think about the sort of jobs today, I'm told that a child starting kindergarten today will probably find that by the time they complete school, futurists tell us that there's a 70% chance they'll be working in a job that doesn't exist at the moment. And we have to do we have to recognise that we need to make an enormous effort to make change to our educational system. What the government has put in, the Victorian government has put in respect of this last budget, we've introduced an optional 13th year of school that is available to kids undertaking what's called a Head Start apprenticeship, such that they will complete year 13 with a fully accredited apprenticeship at Certificate 3 level. Now, I'm not sure that this is the absolute solution, but I know that it means that we've got to start shifting our educational system from the one-size-fits-all approach, that there is an academic level of expertise that we need to reward, and anything that focuses on the practical and the deliverable, those skills should be seen as second rate. I don't think we've done enough in the education system to dispel that myth, and I think the idea, for example, that we now identify 30 of the economy's most important trades and say TAFE for people undertaking those skills will be free. And we do that not out of a sense of being generous with funds, but because our economy desperately needs it. And for too long, we've spent this idea saying that we need to churn out people with one level of expertise via universities. Well, if we want to deliver the skills that industry needs, and needs it now, we're going to have to start challenging that notion, and we're going to have to start making our school and education system the key deliverer of that. And I think, from my personal perspective, that in many ways, if we don't make these changes, there are a lot of kids who are going to be told that they are second rate, when in fact they are exactly in possession of the skills that we need to harness and encourage for the future.
Thanks, gentlemen. I might open the floor to questions if anyone puts their hand up. Yep, we've got one down here, if there's a microphone. And please, as per normal, if you can state your name and the organisation you're representing, and also if you can keep your question fairly short, we'll try to get through a few questions. Thank you.
Treasurer Steve Harrison from the City of Adelaide. I rang a government department here recently in Canberra, and part of the vetting process asked me where I was from, and I said Adelaide, and they said, is that anywhere near Geelong? And I sort of took that to, well, that's how people do view us. Just when you're talking about population, I see New South Wales and Victoria a bit like a popular nightclub, that we should have bouncers at the airport saying 5 can't come in till 5 come out. And would you support federal policy that would actually pull levers to share some of your migrants with states like South Australia and Western Australia?
Well, what our good question. I mean, what our Premier has suggested is that at the very least the states should have a seat at the table when you're talking about the immigration figures, because the reality is New South Wales and Victoria, Sydney and Melbourne are the two cities that do the heavy lifting when it comes to the increase in population. Now, there are economic benefits that come from population growth. We both know that. But at the same time, we need to make sure as our states grow and as our cities grow, they grow well, and the hard infrastructure and the social infrastructure is in place to do that. And we've got a plan in New South Wales at the moment. We've got a 3 cities vision, and we're investing in that infrastructure now. But to have a greater sense planning forward as we're setting our vision up for our cities and states for the next 10, 20, 30 years, that we know where that immigration level is going, because the reality is it's going to be the states of Victoria and New South Wales in the main that will take a substantive share of that population growth.
Steve, it's an interesting notion. I've got this vision of somebody standing on the border with a clicker as people come across, just to make sure that the numbers are kept in equilibrium. I'd make the point, yes, I agree that the state should be at the table when we're talking about migration. There are certain limitations, of course, that attach to states. We manage the result of migration policy. At the moment, we don't really get to set migration policy. Second point I'd make is there are three key drivers of population growth. One is obviously migration, and we've just discussed it. The other is the international migration. The other is interstate migration. And the Australian Constitution absolutely prohibits us putting any restrictions on that. All trade, commerce and intercourse shall be absolutely free. Section 92 of the Constitution. The final one is that it's natural births, of course. And of course, no treasurer is going to get involved in the issue of natural births, and I refer to Section 92 of the Constitution. So the other point I think I'd make is that we do have to recognise that when states are dealing with issues of population, it is very difficult in the sense that when we're talking about a place like Adelaide, you've got a modest population growth going on. When you look at Melbourne, certain suburbs of Melbourne have substantial population growth, but we have councils on the outer edges of Victoria that are actually depopulating, particularly on the western fringe, and they're suffering considerable distress as a consequence of that. And indeed, in this budget, we put aside some funds to try and assist those large area, small population councils that were suffering from depopulation. So it's not a homogeneous system that's occurring here. There's basically the amplification of population growth in the two big international cities. And of course, we'd all like to see it spread around. But the point I'd make is be wary of snake oil salesmen on population. There's a lot of people who go out there saying, well, you know, we're not against population growth, it's just got to be managed better. Well, look at how governments manage the challenges that they have. For our government, it's a pretty simple process. Cut down the cost of employing in regional Victoria. We've reduced payroll tax by 50%. Put in place incentives for young people to move to regional Victoria, and we've doubled the first homeowners grant, and we've taken all stamp duty costs for the acquisition of a property under 600,000. It's about encouraging people to move there, and also recognise that states have a role to play in terms of investing in the infrastructure that better connect regional Victoria and might I say regional Australia to those big amplifiers of economic activity. And finally, recognise that where you can, make judgments about how you can grow government services in those regions so that they have a recognition that government is not just for the big city, it's for everybody.
Can I just add to that as well? I mean, we're seeing the same thing as Victoria. So whilst you've got the Sydney issue in terms of the growth, we're also seeing the regions cry out for greater population, and that's what's happening because we're investing in the productive infrastructure. People want to live in Sydney and Melbourne because they've got great access to healthcare, they've got great access to education and the transport links that are there and the quality of life. We also want to make sure our regions have the same thing, and part of the Snowy transaction, which Tim and I were involved in, we had $4.2 billion from that transaction, which we're investing directly into regional New South Wales, into productive infrastructure to make sure... You
got 4.2, I only got 2.1.
Yeah, we had a greater share, mate. 4 point what? What'd you get?
2.1.
Yeah, 2.1, so we should have. Anyway, but that productive infrastructure going into those areas, so whether you're living in Tweed or you know, in whatever area, in the Monero, in regional New South Wales, you have access to the services that you have in Sydney will drive that growth, and we're seeing those populations increase in those areas, which is very positive.
I think there's a question over here.
Hi, Sherelle Murphy from ANZ. Congratulations, Treasurers, on two very enviable budgets that you've just handed down. Clearly, that's got a lot to do with your great skill as treasurers, but presumably there is a smidgen of luck in there as well. I'm just wondering what happens in your next terms potentially when we don't have the Australian dollar falling, we don't have the global economy picking up, house prices aren't growing at close to double-digit figures, the billions coming in from Snowy Hydro isn't there, and the assets start to dry up. Is it looking like a tougher 4 years ahead than the previous 4 years?
Well, if I'll have the first crack at this, and I'm sure Dom will want to add his 2 cents worth. Look, it's important that we recognise that no government in framing a budget ever has certainty about what the forward estimates or indeed what the outcome of any particular budget year looks like, but rather you've got to make the best advised assessment of what your circumstances are likely to do. So the first point I'd make is have some credibility around your economic forecasts. For the state of Victoria, I can say I rest on my case. I've delivered 4 budgets, 3 of which have been very close to the mark in terms of, and to the extent that they haven't been close to the mark in terms of surplus, they've underestimated the level of surplus that we've had. So a measure of conservatism in budgeting is probably not a bad thing. The other point I'd make is you have to cut your cloth to suit the nature of the budget that you're tailoring. So if circumstances do turn against the state, in Victoria, for example, I've assumed a fall away in stamp duties. I'm told at the moment that those stamp duty numbers are still holding up relatively robustly, but nonetheless it's best to assume that there's at least a conservative fall away of the numbers. I was asked the day that I brought down the budget that Paul Keating once said of Peter Costello that he'd been hit in the arse by a fiscal rainbow. Now, I don't know what a fiscal rainbow is, and it does sound rather unpleasant, but you can't help good luck. All you can do is seize the opportunity when it presents and plan for circumstances changing. You have to be able to make provision in terms of your budget for capacity to deal with those downturns. And I think that's what good budgeting is all about. Yes, it's good luck and it's working hard when the good times are around and recognising that you need to make provision for capacity to deal without the sort of inflows of revenue that we've seen, particularly from our property markets recently.
Well, I'd say from Chanel, from a New South Wales perspective, we've got a very diverse revenue base. Like Tim in his budget recently, we've written down, with a softening of the property market, more particularly in Sydney, we've written down about $5.5 billion over the forwards in stamp duty, but that's residential stamp duty is about 11% of our total revenues. So what's most important to us is that we keep our expenses under control. And one of the most important pieces of legislation we passed in New South Wales was the Fiscal Responsibility Act that keeps our expense growth lower than long-term revenue growth at about 5.6%. And that's really ensured that if we do have an area of revenue that drops off over time, that we're well positioned. And we can have a GST debates rife at the moment, but Western Australia at the moment are out there crying poor. They weren't crying poor when the revenue growth was around 13%, and their expenses were running at the same rate. So we're certainly making sure that we protect ourselves from any downturns going further, and I'm actually incredibly positive about the future opportunities to economic growth in New South Wales going forward. We're in a strong position now, and I think we'll leverage off that and go further. Our public investment in infrastructure, as I said earlier, adds about 0.5 percentage point to our economic growth. We're also seeing significant growth in our education exports, which is also leading to strength in tourism and education-related tourism that comes off the back of that. I also believe Australia, particularly I'd say New South Wales and Victoria, are perfectly positioned for the rise of the middle class in Asia. At the moment, 50% of the world's middle class are based in Europe or North America. By 2030, 60% will be in Asia. The export opportunities that will come our way as a result of this change, and as long as we're ready for that and we're positioning for the future, I think the state of New South Wales is in a very strong position going forward.
It's interesting just listening to what you had to say, Dom, because when you think about it, the fiscal parameters that our two states are putting in place are pretty similar. We have three basic fiscal parameters that sort of set how much capacity we have in any given budget. The first one is run healthy surpluses, and as a rule of thumb, we're talking a $70+ billion revenue base. Around about $1 billion is a sort of number that I like to see. Make sure that your expenditure growth over the economic cycle never exceeds your revenue growth. Otherwise, you're basically running up a deficit on the back of recurrent liabilities. And thirdly, bring debt below the level that you inherited from your predecessors. That's a rule that we've put in place. And they're pretty much well disciplined, that if you can demonstrate to ratings agencies you're prepared to defend, then you'll do pretty well in terms of their assessments. And I assume that's why we're both doing pretty well in terms of how the two ratings agencies assess our performance.
And it probably goes to the point as well, I mean, we take a very similar view to Victoria. We've had over the period of time almost every single one of our budgets positions revised up. Now that's been a frustration to predecessors of mine who had to deliver deficits that ended up being surpluses. But I'd prefer as a treasurer to be surprised on the upside than the downside, and that's what's happened consistently in New South Wales.
I know there's another question over here. Thank you.
Yeah, Sam Walker from Lutheran Services in Queensland. Just staying briefly on the question of demographics, the other huge demographic shift we hear a lot about is the ageing population. And while the direct service provision of aged care is a remit of the federal government, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of how that shift might play out in terms of state government balance sheets, but also where the investments and spendings are now that state government should be looking at to meet some of those changing needs in that community.
Well, from a New South Wales budget position, around 30% of our expenditure is on health, and that's only going to grow. And if you look at the ageing population from where we are today, where you've got 4 people looking after those aged over the age of 65, by 2036, that will reduce to 3. And if you go back to the 70s, it was 7. So there is no doubt that we are going to have to look at doing more with less. Looking at innovative ways of delivering the best healthcare and the best education services we can. But the reality is budgets are coming under strain across the Western world. The New South Wales and Victoria are no different. We've got to continue to look at better ways of doing things, keep that strong financial discipline behind the scenes, deliver strong surpluses, but at the same time make sure that we're looking at world's best practice when it comes to delivering the best healthcare that we can provide, because that is a substantial challenge. And that's why, as part of this budget, we brought in this Generations Fund in New South Wales, because we want to make sure that we are well positioned in the future when those pressures come our way, and there is the need to borrow more, that we make sure that we do have the capacity to retire debt going forward, and make sure that the burden that our kids and their kids have is not greater than ours. And particularly when you see that cost increasing and that ageing population, it's something that's front and centre. And as I raised at the start, it can be very easy for politicians to solve for the problems of the day. What's more important is they position their state well for the future generations, and that's where the real judgment should come of any government, is how they deal with not just the issues of today, but how they set the state up for success.
I won't go over the health side of the ageing issue, but I'd make the point that I think we do have to start look a lot more holistically about the issues that confront all governments with regard to ageing, and particularly how ageing in place strategies can better be adopted, how our planning system will have to adapt to and adjust to it. And increasingly, I think we need to recognise that perhaps perversely and perhaps in a sense contrary to people's normal views about population growth, it is one of the things that is actually acting as a brake on our ageing population growing too fast. In fact, if you looked at the Victorian economy, there are three things that fire it, and they all start with P. So population growth is one element to it. Participation rate in the labour market is the other. And that means we've got younger people on average moving into the labour market and looking for work. And the third and final thing is per capita productivity, and it having a dramatic effect upon the way that the economy is operating. So ageing issues, absolutely, it's going to be a constant argument between tiers of government about whether the appropriate level of investment is being made. For my way of thinking, the planning regime and how we interact with service providers of aged care facilities will be a key part of this story as well going forward.
We've got one last question up the back here. Thank you.
Thanks. Nicholas Gruen from Lateral Economics. I've got a couple of questions. The first is that we've heard nothing from you about what New Zealand calls the investment approach, and I think certainly as treasurers you'll both know what I'm talking about, trying to think about our costs as long-run liabilities in the way that an insurer would, rather than just a few out years in the forecasts. That seems to be something that's pretty obvious, and yet it's amazing we haven't made further strides. The other one is trying to get more efficient state taxation, which is a tricky thing to do, and an obvious thing there would be to try and move more towards land tax and away from stamp duty, which I think the ACT has made some progress on, and would be interested in your observations about that as well.
Well, on the New Zealand investment approach, you sort of look at New Zealand and think, well, they've got a pretty luxurious position to be in, and that is that they have a single system of governance. The only problem is we disagree with the federal government about what that system or what the tier of government should be. As you'd appreciate, there is a lot of argument about where responsibility lies for our healthcare system. As a classic illustration, preventative health principally falls within the preserve of the Commonwealth. The states, of course, deal with the manifestations of that. So the stuff that Bill English, I think, was a groundbreaker in this area, that we should be looking more towards the whole of life costs of investment decisions that we make, requires us to look at the way that the tiers of government intersect with each other in order to get that right. Otherwise, you're essentially only looking at one part of the equation. But is there a place for it? Absolutely, I think there is, because you get distorted investment decisions if you're not thinking, and forgive me for being a treasurer who tries to deal with the issues that confront us from budget cycle to budget cycle, but you know, states get about 50% of their revenue from the Commonwealth. So unless we can sign up to the idea that we should appropriately recognise the value of our investment in preventative strategies, then we're forever going to have a distorted investment strategy. I think there's a lot to be said for what New Zealand has done, but I think it requires us to have a much more mature relationship between state and federal governments about how we might go about recognising it and implementing it. On the perennial issue of stamp duty, land tax, flip, you know, there wouldn't be an economist that I meet with who would tell me that they think it's a wonderful thing to do and it takes the transactional costs out of the acquisition of land, and it would give the states a much more secure revenue base. There are a couple of problems with it. One, it requires us to accept that the states will be imposing a tax on the family home in perpetuity, which I don't think would make me particularly popular, even in the pantheon of treasurers. And secondly, it would require a very substantial level of assistance from the Commonwealth, I presume, to deal with what would be a massive one-off hit or transitional arrangements to state budgets as we effectively flipped, I don't know, $7-8 billion worth of revenue to a much more modest revenue stream that probably in the long term could serve us all much better. For all that, I think it is a long way to go, and there is a lot more work in the way that the equity of the taxation system operates for us to be, rather than to be pursuing the quixotic and purist view that we should have a tax on the family home, because I think I was previously making the point that I quite like my job, and I'm not sure I'd keep it.
Look, I mean, I'd agree with Tim on the sense that both those issues require greater collaboration between the Commonwealth and the states, particularly if you take the land tax stamp duty swap. We had a situation recently where we had 2 Productivity Commission reports come out. One said, here's a whole range of ideas that the states should actually take on board when it comes to productivity. But a first state that moved on a land tax stamp duty swap, if that was the state of New South Wales, we'd potentially lose up to $1.2 billion in GST revenue. So you actually need to have a situation where you have a Commonwealth and state government working more collaboratively together. And if there are areas where there are efficiencies to be found, and I agree with Tim, and I've spoken previously in my former role as Finance Minister about the opportunities of moving to a land tax, a broad-based land tax, as opposed to the stamp duty. And as Tim says, everyone is in favour of it. Politically, it is incredibly challenging. But one of the areas where I think the Board of Treasurers can play a substantive role is in the types of reforms that you're raising, because there are areas where, as states, rather than have the Commonwealth come out with ideas and say, here's what you should do in your perfect world, and leave it at that. These are economic reforms where the states can sit there and say, yeah, look, a lot of these reforms do make sense. Here's how we think if we were to pursue them, they could work. Here's the type of assistance we would need. And perhaps you'd have a situation where states together would move as one to get those reforms over the line. But on all of those things, the blame game needs to stop, and we need to be working a lot more collaboratively in what those areas are, and the support that we think we would need as a state to move down that path.
Thanks, Treasurers. What I might do, thank you for the questions from the floor. I think they were fantastic questions. I'm going to ask Diane Smith-Gander to come up and give a vote of thanks to Australia's top 2 treasurers, but I'm going to let them sort out who's number 1 and who's number 2. But thank you, Diane.